Thank you, everybody, for coming. Welcome to the IISS. My name's Dana Allen. I'm editor of Survival and a senior fellow here. Michael Sean Winters, early this year in the National Catholic Reporter in the U.S., started an article with the words, "When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. And this election cycle is nothing if not weird." And then he went on to discuss the confrontation between Pope Francis and Donald Trump. Other things have transpired in the U.S. election, but one of the virtues of the journal that I edit is that we often rely on the expertise of our speaker today, Massimo Franco, who has shed light frequently on this, for an institute like the IISS, perhaps underserved dimension or underreported dimension of international politics and strategic affairs. Massimo is a political columnist for Corriere della Sera. He's been writing on Italian politics. And is well known as a prominent journalist in Italy, and he's also has great expertise on the Vatican's foreign policy. I think it's his most recent book, if I'm not mistaken, is Il Vatican Secondo Francesco, the Vatican according to Francis. He's also written multiple editions of a book that's appeared in both English and in both Italian and English. Parallel Empires, the Vatican and the United States, 2 centuries of alliance and conflict. As I said, he's a frequent contributor to the journal I edit, Survival. He was also, I guess, quite a number of years now, a visiting fellow here at the IISS. So he's going to talk today about U.S.-Vatican relations in the context of what I described at the outset as a rather interesting American political campaign. Massimo.
Thank you, Dana, for hosting me here. Thank you to all of you for being here. And yes, it's true that time by time I have the honor to contribute to Survival, and it's particularly interesting for me because the environment at the IISS tends not to underline too much the problems of religion, while there is always a political connection. In this case, Dana is particularly fit for chairing this discussion because I think he has a deeper knowledge of American politics than I have. So let me thank all of you, and let me say that these elections are quite tricky for the Vatican, and I would say that we don't know what the outcome will be, but whoever wins the presidential elections in the U.S., there is already a potential loser. I would say it's the Vatican and American bishops. Because it had quite seldom happened that the Holy See was facing 2 candidates to the White House so clearly far from its values and strategic and geopolitical vision. Both Hillary Rodham Clinton and Donald Trump are a kind of alien for different reasons. Hillary is viewed by the Pope's inner circle as a beacon of secular culture and ideology, as an influential cardinal puts it. She mirrors a long cultural battle between Vatican representatives, overall U.S. bishops, on abortion, gay rights, role of women, and the fight between Vatican representatives and Hillary Clinton at the conferences of Cairo in 1994 and in Beijing in 1995, the first on population and the second on the role of women, left a cultural scar in their mutual relation. What is quite telling is that during the present presidential campaign, Democratic candidate and Clinton's opponent, Bernie Sanders, was invited to speak at a conference in Vatican City, organized by the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. Strange move, but a stranger one was the casual meeting between Sanders and the Pope at 6 a.m. in front of Casa Santa Marta, the hostel and papal residence inside the Vatican, while Francis was heading to the airport. It was viewed as a political and diplomatic gaffe, provoked not by the Vatican Secretariat of State, which was taken completely by surprise. They knew of Sanders, as far as they know, just 3 days before his arrival. The Pope himself explained that he had bumped into Sanders by chance. But it had been the informal network around the Pope, in primis Monsignor Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, the Argentinian bishop who organizes these conferences, who had invited Sanders. But that is not important anymore. Whatever the dynamics, the casual encounter didn't add to good relations between the Pope and the Clintons. They'll make us pay a price for that. We don't know how and when, but it will happen, a Vatican official very close to the Pope admitted afterwards. I refer to the Clintons, plural, as there is a long history of tensions and misunderstandings since Bill Clinton was the US president. The struggle with John Paul II on so-said fundamental values like abortion was apparent and quite public. And in the last 18 months or so, Bill Clinton tried twice to get a private meeting with Francis in Casa Santa Marta. And twice he received a courteous but firm refusal of a vis-a-vis conversation. He could be admitted, the Vatican explained, only to the kiss hand ceremony in St. Peter's Square, among other dignitaries. The protocol doesn't allow a different procedure. Furthermore, in the September 2015 visit of Jorge Mario Bergoglio to the US, the papal entourage noticed that Hillary didn't show up even for a hello, and that episode was viewed as the confirmation of a cold relationship. In summary, another Clinton at the White House could be problematic. Problematic for US bishops who fear laws improving a secular vision of American society after the long struggle with Obama on Obamacare. Quite intriguing, just 1 week after the White House elections, a new president of the Conference of US Bishops will be appointed after Joseph Kurtz. It will be quite interesting to understand the tune of the Catholic bishops toward the new US presidency. The fact that Hillary is considered a hawk in foreign policy with a very assertive approach on issues like the Middle East, the Syria dossiers, and Russia might mean tensions with Vatican diplomacy and the Latin American pontiff himself. She supported the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq. She's esteemed and praised by many neoconservatives. Some analysts predict she'll side with Sunnis, Saudi Arabia, against Shiite Iran, and she'll be more confrontational with Russia. So she might be the symbol of the new Cold War with Russia, while for Francis, the Russian Federation and Putin personally are objective allies in the Syrian conundrum to defend Christian minorities from the persecution of the ISIS. Furthermore, Putin is key to a dialogue between the Vatican and the Orthodox Church. And Putin doesn't hide at all his role. On the contrary, he does nothing to hide his influence on Patriarch Kirill. But the Pope knows quite well advantages and limits of this alliance. When I had the honor to ask him if on the Middle East and on the consequence of the bombing of Libya there was almost a convergent analysis with Russia, Francis made clear, although having some goals in common, brackets, Russia has its own interests. So it's good not to exaggerate. But before the intervention, the Pope told in this interview, there was one Gaddafi. Now there are 50 Gaddafis in Libya. The West must go through a process of self-criticism. He added that when dealing with Russia, one must never forget that in Russian blood there are always drops of its past empire. He did not refer, under my impression, to the Soviet Union but to Tsarism. About Trump, the distance is less subtle. It became public in February 2016 when Francis was accused by the Republican candidate to be an agent of the Mexican government on immigration. The reason, as we all remember, a trip to the border between Mexico and the US, where he had celebrated a mass on the Mexican territory and repeated that bridges, not walls, had to be built up to unite and not divide people. Whoever thinks that walls and not bridges are to be built is not a Christian, the Pope said, provoking a blunt answer from Trump. And as an Italian cardinal admits confidentially, nobody knows what remained in Trump's soul after those words, so unusual for Vatican diplomacy. The concern is evident, but it is not a problem connected to the religion of Trump or even of Clinton. Trump is a Protestant Presbyterian, Hillary a Methodist, but this is not the point. Catholic vote intended as a homogeneous bloc does not exist anymore in the US and elsewhere. Also, if it's to underline that since 1972, US Catholics voted in majority for the candidate who won the elections in the US. Furthermore, anti-Catholicism is more outdated than in the past. The problem with Trump is rooted deep inside the Catholic world itself. The concern of the Pope stems from the fear that Trump might become the champion of an international of xenophobia, a sort of beacon of racism, of an exclusive version of Christianity, of white suprematism, attracting many conservative Catholics as well. The phenomenon is already on the rise all over Western and Eastern Europe, with the rise of populist forces. And the peculiarity of the present situation is not just that the number of racists have grown, but rather that demagogues such as Mr. Trump are having a reach beyond a natural basin of voters among disillusioned people who are nor racist nor anti-Islamic. The perspective that the US might elect a president openly against immigration over all Latin America and against Islamism is viewed as a nightmare by an Argentinian pontiff who is struggling to improve and change the relations between Northern and Southern America, and who tries to explain to Catholic conservative circles that Islamism cannot be associated to terrorism. It is a cultural battle fought apparently against Trump, but de facto well underway inside the Catholic world itself. An alliance between European populism and Mr. Trump's racism might prove devastating. That's why, whatever the outcome, the Holy See is worried by the US emerging from the presidential campaign, a country divided, bitterly split on fundamental values, with xenophobic and secular positions both radicalized. The problem is worsened by the approach of Francis to issues like gay rights and marriage of divorced people. In general, a very inclusive and intermittently disorienting interpretation of Catholic doctrine. In many Western dioceses, his words are not always understood and time by time are silently disputed or even refused. His last choice, picking 17 cardinals from all over the world, but not from Europe and Italy, if not incidentally, has confirmed doubts about his enduring lack of confidence towards Europe. It is a cultural divide. Francis is a Latin American, and to him the old continent is aging, secular, and not in tune with his idea of the Catholic Church rooted in the peripheries of the world. The hegemony of the West, more in general, is far from his vision of the future. If the Catholic Church is a field hospital, as he labeled it at the very beginning of its pontificate, The West is a field hospital as well, a reality and a model of societies in decline, with values to update or reshape totally. The 17 cardinals that he picked up were an assertion of leadership that makes it more likely that Francis' successor would continue his policies rather than reverse them, as many of his critics would wish. The appointments confirm the shift of the center of gravity of the Catholic Church away from Europe towards the South. But such a strategy brings strategic implications as well. Francis is against the West-East divide. To him, the Cold War, be the old or a new one, is a concept difficult to understand and to accept. The Pope is the major strategist of the diplomacy of mercy, as editor-in-chief Antonio Spadaro wrote in La Civiltà Cattolica, the quarterly of the Italian Jesuits, on 13 February 2016. Spadaro is a loyal interpreter of the Pope's thought. The Argentinian pontiff envisions a foreign policy where the Holy See aims at direct and fluid relationships with superpowers without joining a preordained network of alliances and influence. There is a refusal to divide the world between victims and executioners. Even in front of terrorism, Spadaro wrote, Francis' reaction is dismay, not just taking side. Easy to guess the difficulty to make such an approach acceptable to a portion of Western public opinion, frightened and horrified by ISIS terrorist attacks. Even circles of the Catholic world, which live the economic crisis, immigration and terrorism as threats to defend themselves from, might find it difficult to accept. Francis is still hugely popular, but he's swimming against the tide. And the US might prove the strongest tide to swim against. Our strategy can only be that of the lesser evil, a close advisor of Pope says. There are many fields where dialogue can be a substitute for confrontation, but the impression is that the first impact with the new US administration will be quite tough. And in March 2013, it was the US obliged to understand what had happened in the conclave which elected Bergoglio. Now it will be the reverse. It is the Vatican obliged to understand what Clinton and Trump mean to the Holy See and to the entire world. It is a challenge from which the two parallel empires might emerge transformed and more distant than in the past.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Very, very interesting, very thought-provoking. Let me
thank the Apostolic Nuncius Antonello Mennini for coming here and joining us. Thank you very much.
Let me start with the Clinton problem. And I assume that we shouldn't, because Trumpism is so radical, if I can, we might be, and because he looks very likely to lose, we might be tempted to put that to one side. But nonetheless, I think it's a phenomenally important moment in American history. So I don't think we can. I think Trump definitely has to be part of the discussion. But I am struck by your analysis of the problem posed by Clinton's liberal secularism. And I think you even used the word radical at one point. I'm not sure, but I'm just trying to think,
I say that the U.S. appears radicalized,
right,
both on the Trump side and on the Democratic side.
Well, this is what I want to press you on. As I was trying to think here, and I was tempted to Google it, but I was afraid I would be misconstrued what I was doing. As I recall, in my lifetime, there have been 3 Catholics on a ticket, on a presidential ticket, and I'm sure I'm missing something. Is Paul Ryan Catholic?
Yes.
Okay, so there's been 4, and maybe there are others. But so John Kennedy, people can tell me. John Kennedy, John Kerry, and Tim Kaine, very interestingly, and Paul Ryan. So obviously, three of those 4 were avatars of American liberalism. Particularly Kaine, who, as I'm sure you know, has had an association with liberation theology, but I think certainly has not been associated or did not internalize any of the Marxist content of that theology. So what I'm trying to, the premise of my question is, in that context, we can discuss how that is a problem for the Vatican and the Catholic Church, but it's certainly an old problem. I don't really see a huge gap between John Kennedy and Hillary Clinton, frankly, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but maybe.
Unfortunately, my impression is that U.S. bishops do.
Uh-huh.
Because my impression is that Hillary Clinton is viewed as a very radical liberal, more than Barack Obama, and more in general among the Democrats. I'm trying to figure out what John Kerry's candidacy, if it would have succeeded in these elections with this Pope, probably more than when it happened, because he was crucified for his liberal positions. But what I perceive about Hillary Clinton is a very rooted lack of confidence in the Catholic circles, be liberal or conservative, because she's considered culturally hostile. And so with John Kennedy, it was different. Paradoxically, it was John Kennedy who tried to keep the Catholic Church at arm's length, because he knew that in the United States there was a strong prejudice against Catholicism in the 60s. Today, the problem is that what I perceive, maybe I'm wrong, is that while with Obama the relations were diplomatized by the Vatican, and they found a common ground on immigration, on many social issues. With Hillary Clinton, there might be the same approach in the end, but at the beginning, there is a strong mutual, not just lack of confidence, but they are not in tune. So this is a big question mark, and what we must not underestimate is foreign policy. I think that the approach of Hillary Clinton is very much esteemed by also some neoconservatives, because she is very assertive. She thinks that military intervention to grant U.S. security is something is an option. So all these number of problems tend to depict her as a possible trouble in the relations with this Vatican, with this Pope, which is particularly against military interventions, which doesn't share the division between East and West, but more in general, at U.S. level, I think that the struggle with U.S. bishops might be deeper than in the past.
Okay. We won't continue this discussion right now, except to note that in Democratic Party politics, the general feeling is that Hillary Clinton is too far to the right, including on foreign policy, as you said. But let me open it up to the floor and see if there are any other.
Could I just, I'm afraid, pursue the last point? Not pursuing Clinton quite so rigorously, but you did say, and I can say with some confidence, and I've written it down, don't usually make things up, not being a journalist, or pardon to any journalist present, but you said that on how anti-Catholicism is now more outdated. It was a very careful usage of words. More outdated? I mean, has it ever been outdated? And secondly, are the bishops going to be autonomous sufficiently to launch their own campaigning strategies, even within their own diocese in the States, which would be another network?
Yes, and I start from the second point. And my guess is that US bishops are more conservative than the Pope, most of them. So I think that the struggle with the Clinton administration might be tougher than according to the Pope's views. That's because they have autonomy. That means that the cultural struggle will be very apparent. And about outdated anti-Catholicism, yes, no, I think that more in general, I think that a Catholic problem doesn't exist as in the past in the United States. I mean, I think that as far as a Catholic vote, as a block of vote, homogeneous block of vote, doesn't exist anymore, I think that Catholic Americans are first of all Americans, and they vote according to their orientations, but there isn't a prejudice as there was in 1960s or in the past. I think that that has passed. And what is quite confusing is that the label that US Catholics tend to give to their religiosity. For instance, it was said that Tim Kaine, the vice presidential candidate of Hillary Clinton, is a Pope Francis Catholic because he's a liberal. But I agree just up to a point on this definition, because I think that the Pope is very much against the death penalty. And while...
So is Kaine.
Yes, but but when there was a problem of death penalty, he accepted it. So, I think that that doesn't depend on Kaine. That depends, I think, on what the Pope says, which is creating sometimes confusions, and everybody tends to use the words of the Pope on his or her behalf. That's my impression.
I mean, I believe that Kaine, and now I'm trying to remember, what Kaine did is he oversaw an execution as governor of Virginia. I mean, he interpreted that as his duty as governor to implement the law, but he was completely opposed to the death penalty.
Yes.
I mean, just to be clear.
Same about gay marriages and about divorce and so on.
Well, I mean, I was just going to observe on this. This is one of those interesting developments in the United States. So much of our politics concerns the Supreme Court, and it is a striking fact, that there are no Protestants on the Supreme Court. There are Jews and Catholics among those 9. The Catholics, again, I'm not...
The president himself.
Sorry?
The president himself is a Catholic.
The Chief Justice, yes.
Yeah.
And I was going to say the Catholics on the Supreme Court, unless I'm missing somebody, tend to be very much from the conservative wing, and the Jews tend to be, as most American Jews are, from the liberal wing. But yes, somebody...
James
Yes.
Siren's book will be quite good reading.
Sorry?
James Siren's book will be.
Thanks.
I do.
I think I'm right in that Mike Pence also used to be a Catholic and is now an evangelical.
Possible.
His family was an Irish Catholic family. He converted to
And that
Protestantism.
goes with the sort of right, but my question is going to be, it's a fascinating analysis and a rather pessimistic one, but in the hard, brutal world of politics, when a new president takes office, they're concentrating on the sort of major issues of the day. And one can't help but feel that, let us say, a Hillary Clinton president would say to Governor Kane, Vice President Kane, as he might be, you look after this. You are a Catholic, you understand them. It's not going to be top of the pops. It's not going to be a sort of major issue. Unless and until some kind of conflict comes along. And of course, people, the US ambassador or chargé d'affaires will paddle on to the Vatican and say, of course, please, could you say something about just war that is going to be supportive? So I just wonder if these kinds of issues are ones that are going to take their time to evolve. And are not going to be immediately something that come and affect the day-to-day relations between the United States and the Vatican. It
Well,
also depends what kind of ambassador is posted to the Vatican.
I think that it would be very interesting to see the appointment of the new president of U.S. bishops, because that might give the tune to the relations with the new White House. This is the first point. The second, my impression is, but probably Monsignor Menin knows much better than I, that the Vatican and U.S. bishops are going to see these relations in the long run. So now there is a wait-and-see approach, because actually they don't know exactly what Trump or more probably Hillary Clinton are going to do on the issues which are particularly dear to them. But I think that there will be a double horizon to observe closely. The first one is the domestic one, which means laws of the administration and the U.S. bishops. The second is foreign policy. So there are two levels to which we'll have to observe this relationship. And my impression is that we might see a difference in dealing with this administration by the Vatican and by U.S. bishops. And my impression is that on social values and moral values, the U.S. bishops will be maybe tougher than the Pope, while on foreign policy, the Pope and the Vatican, the Holy See, might be tougher than U.S. bishops.
Matthew.
This is a very niche question, so this may turn out to be more of a comment. But assuming it's a Clinton presidency, one of the foreign policy related priorities that might come up early on is the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which the Senate rejected in '99 and which has been waiting for US ratification. And it strikes me that the Pope has actually been quite forward-leaning on nuclear disarmament, and his statements on nuclear disarmament have been quite strong. The Clinton administration would need significant help getting the CTBT through the Senate, really significant help. And this is sort of in the middle of that split that you describe on social issues, on foreign policy issues. This is actually one where a foreign policy related issue where interests might be aligned. So I wonder whether a sort of confidence building measure would be a strong Vatican support for a US push to ratify the CTBT. I told you it was a niche question, but actually there is a very this is a very important treaty that's been waiting for nearly 2 decades in kind of purgatory, and they'll be needing the help. So I wonder whether actually this is one item which is relatively uncontroversial for both sides.
May I ask the Nuncius to answer?
Coming back to the question of the radical position of Mrs. Hillary Clinton, I think that we can agree upon with what Massimo was saying. And from what we read, I think that somebody could have the impression that she lacked of realpolitik, given the presence of many Hispanic people. Yeah, most of them are Catholic. They are very dedicated to their, I wouldn't say the faith, but especially the faith, religion, and so on. And then we could also see that from what we say on the attitude of Mr. Pence, the number 2 of Trump, that he presents himself as the defender of against abortion and so on. Then, because he tried to balance the position of Trump and so on. That's all the position of Lady Clinton. And then we can't deny that in the past we see the many moral issues which have also social consequences have divided the Vatican from the White House and also the contrary. And the matter becomes more urgent if we see that other more important issues for Catholic people are still there on the edge, like for example Tunisia and so on. They take care of old people and so on. The picture of Franco is very interesting. It also is very troubling and worrying, because in fact, looking at the present electoral campaign, get the impression that there is a lack of vision, you see, for what concerns the future of America, the future of the world, and so on. Because up to now, you see, also for what concerns foreign policy, it's not clear what Minister Clinton would do, but what she said, in fact, apart of this what that many people also in India say that the Russophobia is wrong, but he had the impression that there is not much more. For what concerns the attitude of Catholic bishops, it's true they are quite conservative. It's not by chance that the Holy Father, when he visited last year the United States, insisted a lot with them on the fact that they should put aside the concrete policy, not to mix, to enter the political field, but to go out, to look after the poor, to look after this is quite a difficult matter.
And what about the nuclear?
It's not the nuclear, it's the CTBT.
Yeah. Do you think that? Yeah. Do you think there will be a support of U.S. bishops to
for the nuclear armament? I don't believe that. You see, now we have a similar question in Scotland. The Catholic bishop, not officially the Episcopal Conference, but the Episcopal Commission for Peace and Justice. Also, of late, they have issued a very strong document against the Trident policy.
A strong document against the Trident policy.
Yes, of course.
So the question is whether they might do something similar for disarmament in the United States. Possibly. Okay. That's interesting. Thank you. Nomi.
Thank you. I just want to answer or to add to Matt's very niche question, just because CTBT is something I think that we probably most of the people here don't really deal with. But the Vatican is involved in fact to work on these issues. Very, it's also an issue for the Vatican because they're very interested in these issues. So to answer your question, I'm very simple. There's tremendous potential there, and there's some activity going on behind the scenes. And I think it's not just CTBT, it's also the CWC, which hasn't been any militarization yet. And it is, obviously Monsignor really knows the ins and outs of all this, but in terms of potential specifically on the CTBT as opposed to, all the other primary issues, I think it's an excellent point that you raised, because as you say, there is convergence. Michael, that was just in response to Matt. In terms of what I wanted to just retouch, it was fascinating, very depressing.
I know.
It's okay.
Imagine for me.
Yes, well, we like you, Massimo, because you're always very honest and you say what you think. So that's, that's where you've learned your education in all your writings and all your presentations. So thank you for sharing it with us. But one great concern, of course, is US-Russia relations. I mean, I'm assuming great concern for the Pope is US-Russia relations. And I'd like your views on what you think, or maybe also Monsignor Menini would like to elaborate upon this. Given the tensions between these two countries, do you see the Pope playing an active role, and it's in terms of not really outward deviation, but at least, he said the appointment of the bishops obviously is very important. Well, I'll rephrase. What kind of role do you see the Pope playing with regards to the tension between the US and Russia?
Well, I think that the Vatican, the Holy See, has of course a very strong soft power, but that is useful and can be influential to facilitate the relations when these relations are heading towards reconciliation. If these positions are radicalized, and we're talking these weeks of a new Cold War, I'm not sure that the Vatican can do that much to stop this trend. So there might be something which is the reverse, that the Vatican is associated to Putin, which might be a big mistake, because I remember quite neatly that when I interviewed the Pope is not pro-Putin. He doesn't identify the Vatican position with Russia's. The Pope knows that there are some goals, like protecting Christian minorities or the dialogue with Orthodoxy, which must pass through the Kremlin. And the second point, which is not very much underlined, is that Vatican considers Russia as one of the doors towards China. So this is, I think, the big picture. But if the West is going elsewhere, is going to increase the confrontation with Russia, I don't know what the Vatican can actually do. I'm quite skeptical that the Vatican can do something. I see rather a Vatican which is invited more and more strongly to join the Western Front. And that might be a source of tensions, because I don't think that this Pope and this Vatican think that Western strategic centrality is still there. So that's what I perceive as a perspective.
And on that forum, how active is the Pope has set up a new foreign policy council. How active would that, or is that council? No, not right.
I don't think that. You mean the nine cardinals committee?
Yes, the 9 cardinals committee.
Well, I think that it's not so operational as one might think, because they don't meet very often. They talk about strategic goals, but in a very general way. So honestly, I can't see this institution as an operational one. What I see is that the Secretary of State is very operational, is very active, he knows every dossier, and as far as I understand, for instance, about the propaganda war fought by the Kremlin, they know very well that this is a propaganda war, and I don't think that they agree with the Kremlin on many points. But this is different from deciding that there is a second Cold War.
But you said something earlier, which is kind of interesting, and again, I may have misinterpreted it. One of your big points about the Francis worldview is that Western hegemony is over or is ending. And here's the key question, and it should be ending. Is that part of it? I mean, should it be accelerated? Because of course, from buildings like this, we're all preoccupied with the dangers of the. I mean, leaving historical justice aside, the degradation of Western hegemony, or let's say American strategic superiority over China, is seen as a problem to be faced. And are you suggesting that from the Vatican it looks like a solution to a problem?
No, I think that, again, it's my guess. But my impression is that the Vatican thinks that the West cannot think to solve its problem going back to the past. So a balance of power at world level is finished. To try to rebuild it, calling for a new Cold War, is something that the Vatican will never accept. And the second point is that my impression is that the Holy See wants to reshape the model of society of the West because they think, be right or wrong, that it has failed. It didn't solve the problems. So I would say that, as I said in my remarks, if the Church, and it's true, is a field hospital, the West is a field hospital as well. It means that there are many scars to be cured, to be treated. That's my impression. So I don't think that they say that the Western world must finish and this end must be accelerated.
Right.
It's different. If the West thinks to solve its own problems going back to the past, that will not solve the problem. It's going to worsen them. That's my impression.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I have one general question, because you mentioned, obviously, it's about US-Vatican relations, and you mentioned relations with Russia. Could you offer some insights about the relations between the Vatican and the European Union? I hear from your speech that there's convergence on especially the issue of the opposition to populism. The European Union came out with the EU global strategy this summer, which was unhappily released 5 days after the Brexit referendum results. And it's being energetically promoted still by High Representative Federica Mogherini, trying to bring all EU capabilities together for some kind of global approach. And I wonder also, does it help the Vatican that the High Representative on Foreign Affairs is an Italian?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
I don't think that this is the point. I think that the Vatican is very much internationalized. And first of all, I don't think that Federica Mogherini has a major influence on foreign policy, because today I think that in Europe, nations matter, not the European Union. This is the big problem of today's Europe, that Europe as a collective body is in crisis because nationalisms are prevailing. First. Second, what is quite telling is that the relationship of this Pope with Europe is quite helter-skelter. I would say it's sketchy. You understand that this Pope or didn't elaborate sufficiently on Europe, or has a very severe judgment on Europe because it doesn't speak so frequently on the European Union. And there is a fact which I would like to underline, that some days ago there was a meeting of the European conferences of Catholic bishops in Monte Carlo, and in this occasion, the new president appointed is the president of the Italian bishops, Angelo Bagnasco. Why is it telling for me? Angelo Bagnasco is going to finish his appointment in spring. Bagnasco is not considered a cardinal close to the Pope. The Italian bishops are quite disoriented by the fact that the Pope doesn't choose the archbishops of Venice or of Turin as cardinals. So the European Conference of Bishops appointed an Italian cardinal. What is the meaning of this appointment? And it will last for 5 years. So that means that there is a tension underway, and that Europe and the Pope are not always in tune. I think that there are many bishops in Poland, in Spain, in Italy, in part of the German episcopate, who are not in tune with the Pope, not at all. So what I have perceived in this election, in this appointment, is that there might be, in the perspective, a conclave in which you'll have European bishops against the rest of the world. Maybe I'm forcing the perspective, but it's something that it was noticed. It was noticed, although in the press it didn't come out, but it was noticed.
You know, Massimo, this I mean, it strikes me.
I know that he's very skeptical.
No, I'm not skeptical at all. But there is something striking. I mean, let me preface this by saying, of course, I'm one of these liberal admirers of Pope Francis, who maybe is naive about the nature of my admiration or the nature of his message. But it is at a time when the European Union is facing its biggest crisis since it was founded, probably. It is at least an irony or possibly a tragedy that the Vatican would not be more interested in it, if that's what you're saying, given that the European Union is probably the secular institution that is the greatest triumph of Catholic thought, isn't it? I mean, it was founded by Catholics and great Catholic thinkers at the end of World War II.
The Gasperi Schumann of the Bible.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I agree with you totally. It's a tragedy and the irony, both of them, I think. But, well, let me say that...
Is that partly accelerated by the fact you have he is the first non-European Pope, right?
Maybe, because what the conclave said is that there was a shift from Europe from the west to the south of the world, because of demography, because of number of faithfuls, because of the weakness and the divisions inside the European and Western episcopates. But my impression is that the Pope is trying to elaborate a Vatican vision of Europe, but it's not yet there. And what I perceive is that if the Vatican looks a bit distant from the European crisis, that is because from the very beginning of the European Union construction in the last 25 years or so, the Catholic Church has seen more an economic and banking construction than a moral construction. So there has been this ambivalent approach to Europe. Yes, Europe must keep united, but this is the Europe of the bankers. So there are strong currents of Catholic culture which are close to a populist view, or what has become a populist view of the European construction. That's the outcome of this double standard by Europe and the contradictions of Europe.
Yes.
Sorry, Nick Greenstuff. I think obviously you touched on populism, Massimo, and the implications of that within the political structures as well as now the social structures. So we're seeing greater fragmentation at political entities as well as social entities. And I think when you look at the nature and shape and the positioning of the Catholic Church within that, you need to be navigating extremely carefully, which would appear to be what Francis is choosing to do. But if you begin to insert the Catholic Church into some areas of policy vacuums, which is what populism will begin to engender, and that fragmentation will engender, you need to be very careful about the perception of that by electorates, be they Catholic or other. How do you think Francis is going to try and navigate that? And particularly for the US, where we're seeing huge amounts of social fragmentation, how do you begin to create some consistency of approach without alienating tracts of the population and facing that repercussion?
I think it's a very difficult task. It's very challenging because I think that about the US, there is a strong prejudice not towards Catholicism, but towards this Pope. There are conservative circles which tend to depict Francis as a crypto-communist. And they say that he's a friend of the theology of the liberation, South American theology of the liberation. They think that he sells, as one said, Marxist stuff. So for the Pope, it's difficult. I think that there is, in this case, a biased opinion against an Argentinian Pope. Because what most people don't know, I think, is that this Pope, when he was an archbishop and he was Cardinal of Buenos Aires, he was considered a rightist, not a leftist. So in the Jesuit company, he was viewed as a conservative. And saying that he's a friend or an ally of the theology of the liberation is very misleading. Cardinal Bergoglio, when he was in Buenos Aires, invented the theology of the people, which was an original version and an anti-communist version of the theology of the liberation. So his approach to the theology of the liberation, referring to the US perceptions, is that he embraces them because they are dead. They have lost in history. So he says, yes, I am your interlocutor, but it must be clear that you have lost. Marxism has lost. So what I perceive is that this Pope in the US is trying to pass the separation between Republican bishops and Democratic bishops. But with these elections underway, it will be more difficult for him and for US bishops because Trump can be defeated, but Trumpism will be there for a long time and will affect even Hillary Clinton policy. So I think the Pope and the Bishop will be obliged to be careful because this fragmentation remains there. And if there is an election in which people, as Trump says, the elections are rigged, well, this is a big problem for the American society. Not for the world, but first of all for American society. And the church will be one of the epicenters of this problem.
Final question.
You partly answered it, because I was going to ask you to elaborate on what you talked about, the tensions between North America and South America with the two potential, probably Hillary Clinton, but possibly Trump. And obviously with the Trump scenario, that's clearer. But with Hillary, but then you started to talk about liberation theology, so I'm sure you referred to that. But what are the tensions that you foresee, given that Francis isn't a liberation theologist, but was a conservative?
Yes, well...
So what are the tensions? And there's also, given the conservative position of the North American cardinals and bishops versus what we know about the South American counterparts?
First, I think that in a portion of North American bishops, there is a disillusion towards Francis. Some US cardinals voted for Francis without knowing him personally. One of the symbols of this disillusionment was former Archbishop of Chicago, Francis George, who died some months ago. I think maybe last year, sorry if I don't remember exactly. And Francis George made an interview in which he said many critical words towards Francis. And he said that his Brazilian colleagues in the conclave told him to vote for Francis, that they have assured that, So there is some confusion today about what the Pope was supposed to do and what actually did or said. This is the first point. That said, my impression is that the Pope is trying to pass this separation between Southern and Northern America. Today in Rome there is a Pontifical Council for Latin America. My impression is that in the next future, that council might become a council for the Americas, uniting symbolically the two parts of the continent, which means that they want to have a general approach so to cancel this cultural divide between a Latin America which has been historically Catholic and a Northern America which has been historically Protestant, because there are Latinos, because the prejudice towards Catholics is lower than in the past. The tensions which are going to remain, in my view, with Clinton and between Clinton and US bishops is on values, is on the laws which Hillary Clinton might be intended to approve. This will be, I think, a very important point, because I think that US bishops don't share the view that today's United States are represented by Trump and by Clinton. They think that there is not an overwhelming, but a big portion of the people who are not represented by these two candidates. And their values are not represented by these candidates. So that might be a bone of contention in the next months. About foreign policy, it's at a different level, at international level with the Holy See. I don't know if that's what you wanted to know. Yes? Okay.
Yeah, no, I was really, you said there was tension, would be tension if Hillary Clinton became president from the Vatican's viewpoint because of the tension between North and South America. I think you said that, so I just wanted to
sorry. About the Vatican, I think that the tensions with Hillary Clinton might rise more on foreign policy, on the Middle East.
Yeah, but not North-South relations.
Less. I think less. It depends. It depends on the approach, because what Francis tried to say during his trip to the United States in September 2015 was that the United States had to change their approach to Latin America. So Latin America is not a colony of the United States. It must be something you must confront in a better way. Because why? Now that communism is over there, the United States has a big chance to transform Latin America according to democracy, democratic values. So there should be, in the Pope's view, a common interest to transform Latin America in a democratic continent, political democratic. And this is important for the Pope for a second reason, because this split inside Latin America was not just political, was religious. So there was a split inside the episcopates. Catholics were divided and radicalized by dictatorships, democracy, Marxism. Now that all of this is quite over, you can change all the approach.
Well, we spent less time talking about Donald Trump than I would have expected, and somehow that seemed to work out perfectly. So I want to. I think this was an excellent and really fascinating hour, and I hope everybody will join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you.